Hey gang, it's your favorite teacher Arjun again, here with some endocrine anatomy. As with our other videos, we here at First Aid like to ask questions, and it's not because we like to hear ourselves talk. Even though you could wait the 1 or 2 seconds it takes to hear the answer, I strongly encourage you to try to come up with some of the answers on your own. It'll help keep you engaged and give you sort of an idea of how well you actually remember some of this stuff. Endocrine anatomy's not too intense, so let's dive right in. Let's start with our friends the adrenal glands sitting right on top of the kidneys. A quick gross anatomy rundown. Venous drainage differs by side, much like the gonads. The left adrenal drains into the left renal vein before it hits the IVC, whereas the right adrenal drains directly into the IVC itself. Arterial blood supply is threefold and comes from the phrenic artery, the aorta, and the renal artery. It's not the best diagram, but actually it's the venous drainage that ends up getting tested most often. Identifying the adrenals on a CT can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're used to seeing images like these that represent the adrenals as purely superior to the kidneys. I'll give you a moment to play Where's Waldo with the adrenals. Try to locate these for yourself. And by the way, ignore this huge gallstone. We'll call that an incidental finding. As you can see, they're not only superior, but also anteromedial to the kidneys. Remember from renal that the left kidney, and thus the left adrenal, sits a little bit higher than the right. Now normally they look a little bit like the inside of a Mercedes-Benz logo, but as always there's a bunch of fun pathology that can make them look pretty wacky. Now it'd be pretty sadistic for the step 1 folks to make you identify adrenal pathology on CT, but if you know what a normal adrenal gland looks like, you should be able to identify a gross abnormality like a mass, in the event that they ask you to identify one. So that's gross anatomy. Now let's take a cross-section of our friend the adrenal gland and pick it apart from the outside in. The adrenals are surrounded by a fibrous capsule, but the most important structural and functional distinction is between the steroid-producing cortex and the catecholamine-producing adrenal medulla. The cortex is divided up into 3 zones, each one of which contains a different arsenal of enzymes to generate a different set of steroids. From outside to in, the zones are named glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Remember G, F, R. Like the kidneys, they're sitting right on top of. These zones are responsible for the production of mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and weak androgens, respectively, which regulate salt, sugar, and sex. They say the deeper you go, the sweeter it gets, because as we all know, sex is hilarious. But real talk, the activity of these hormones is a lot more complicated than just salt, sugar, sex, so we'll go into them in a lot more detail in the physiology section. Now this is more of a physiology point as well, but it's worth asking. What hormone do you expect is the primary regulator of the steroids produced by the adrenal cortex? Hint, it practically has adrenal cortex in the name. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is the primary regulator of both glucocorticoids and adrenal androgens. But it actually has almost no control over the secretion of mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids, exemplified by aldosterone, are functionally a part of the renin-angiotensin axis, and are generally feedback regulated by the blood pressure. Again, that's a gross oversimplification, so be sure to check out the renal physiology section for a much better explanation. We talked about the embryologic divisions of the adrenal gland during embryo review. Remember what germ layers the cortex and medulla are derived from? The cortex is derived from mesoderm, and the medulla, which acts almost like a postganglionic sympathetic nerve, is derived from ectoderm, specifically neural crest. So if ACTH controls the release of steroids from the cortex, what hormone releases catecholamines from the medulla? I'm just kidding, that was a trick question. Unlike most stuff in the endocrine section, this one doesn't work on the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Instead, it works a lot like the rest of the sympathetic nervous system. As you may remember, the SNS always involves 2 peripheral neurons, one preganglionic neuron that synapses onto a postganglionic neuron that then synapses onto a muscle fiber. In this case, the preganglionic neuron synapses onto the adrenal medulla, which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, much like any other postganglionic sympathetic nerve. However, instead of secreting it onto a muscle fiber, the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine straight into the bloodstream. While we're on our fun little tangent back into autonomic glands, anyone remember the neurotransmitter secreted by the preganglionic neuron? It's acetylcholine, and it's picked up by nicotinic ACH receptors. And that's going to be the same no matter whether you're in the adrenal medulla or in a postganglionic sympathetic neuron. You should be able to identify the various functional layers of the adrenal gland from a histologic specimen as well. If you can, try to orient yourself and figure this one out on your own. Remember, they may not give you a nice easy orientation, but you'll still be expected to recognize the cell types for the exam. Alright, time's up. Let's do this one together. So, the pathologists out there will probably not like my explanation for this, so I'll go ahead and address this right off the bat. Yes, the terms glomerulosa fasciculata and reticularis apparently refer to the histologic appearance of the cortical layers, and no, I've never been able to see it. The people who get this are probably just more sophisticated than I am, but I'll just tell you what I think is the easiest way to tell these apart. First, the capsule and the medulla are pretty easy to spot. The capsule is mostly collagen, with very few cells scattered around the inside, and the medulla is much more basophilic. It's got sort of a porous appearance to it due to the many vascular channels that are inside of it. So that just leaves the three layers of the cortex. Take a moment to try to demarcate those on your own, and let's see if you still remember the order of the cortical layers. So if the order is G, F, R, then the fasciculata is the middle layer, and I'll highlight it for you right here. So it's recognizable by its porous appearance, but unlike the medulla, it's not porous because it's highly vascular. It's porous because the lipid droplets, which are not preserved on the slide, appear like multiple little pores. Remember, the zona fasciculata produces cortisol, the eponymous steroid of the adrenal cortex, and therefore hoards the most cholesterol. The glomerulosa is closer to the capsule, and the reticularis is closer to the medulla. The reticularis actually contrasts really nicely with the medulla because it's very eosinophilic, or red-looking, and the medulla is very basophilic, or blue-looking. You got all that? Good, because now it's time for another flash quiz. First question. What is the middle layer of the adrenal cortex, and what does it produce? And the answer is the zona fasciculata, which produces cortisol. Not so painful, right? Okay, I think that's about enough for the adrenal gland. Let's move on to the captain of the SS endocrine itself, the pituitary gland. So grossly speaking, the pituitary gland is that dangly jobby that sits beneath the hypothalamus at the base of the brain. Remember what that part of the skull is called, the one the pituitary sits inside? It's the sella turcica, or the Turkish saddle. No idea why they thought the base of the skull looked Turkish. So, what looks like Mexico with a pair of testicles is actually my attempt at a schematic diagram of the hypothalamus and pituitary, divided up into the functionally distinct anterior and posterior pituitaries. There's the intermediate lobe, which you really don't have to know anything about for step 1, except that it produces melanotropin, which stimulates melanocytes to make you darker. Now, the cool thing is that much like the adrenal gland, this gland is diverse in its embryonic origin. Remember that buzzword that's always associated with the anterior pituitary's embryology? Rathke's pouch? It's derived from surface ectoderm by a process that you don't actually have to be familiar with. But simply knowing the name Rathke's pouch equals easy points on step 1. This is sort of your gland portion, like the adrenal cortex. So where does the posterior pituitary come from? Hint! It's in the alternate name for the posterior pituitary, neurohypophysis. Basically, like the adrenal medulla, the posterior pituitary is of neurologic origin, in this case neuroectoderm, and not neural crest, because we're in the central nervous system. Remember your embryology, folks. Neuroectoderm equals CNS, and neural crest equals PNS, generally speaking. So the blood supply here is pretty interesting, because it's home to a second and far less famous portal venous system, the hypophyseal portal system. And like the more famous hepatic portal system, it's present to ensure that the products of the first capillary bed are routed straight into another capillary bed before they have the chance to hit the systemic circulation. In this case, the hypothalamus secretes trophic hormones that cause the release of 6 different hormones from the anterior pituitary. We'll talk a lot about these feedback loops in the physiology section, but by and large they're pretty intuitive. So, how does the hypothalamus control the secretion of hormones from the posterior pituitary? Alright, you can relax. That wasn't really a fair question, because the posterior pituitary is actually just made up of axonal projections from the hypothalamus. So there's no trophic hormones traveling through the portal system like there is for the anterior pituitary. These hormones are simply generated in the cell bodies found in the hypothalamus, travel down the axon, escorted by neurophycins, which are chaperone proteins, and end up being secreted at the axon terminals found in the posterior pituitary. Pretty cool, huh? There are 6 hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. Think you can name them all? Go ahead, pause the video. I'm not going anywhere. So these hormones are FSH, LH, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, and oxytocin. These hormones conveniently form the mnemonic flat pig. No, not a fat pig. I meant a flat pig. Get out of here. Ah, there he is. Cute, he's standing on the first aid sign. So cells of the pituitary are histologically divided up into basophils and acidophils, depending on how they stain. Basophils staining either blue or purple, depending on the stain, and acidophils staining a brighter red. The flat hormones of flat pig are produced by basophils, and the pig hormones are produced by acidophils. Now I want to clear something up about what an acidophil and a basophil actually means. These are not 2 different cell types. These are just descriptions of how they stain. There are 5 different cell types that secrete 6 different pituitary hormones, and it just so happens that the corticotrophs, gonadotrophs, and thyrotrophs all take up bases and stain blue, so we call them basophils. Similarly, both lactotrophs and somatotrophs take up acids and stain red, so we call them acidophils. Finally, 3 of the flat hormones, which are secreted by the basophils, actually look pretty similar. FSH, LH, and TSH all have the same alpha subunit. It's the beta subunit, however, that gives these hormones their specificity. Interestingly enough, this structure is also shared by another non-pituitary hormone. Remember what it is? It's human chorionic gonadotropin, a hormone that's similar to FSH and LH in that it promotes the secretion of progesterone. In large enough doses, however, HCG's alpha subunit can even trick the body into thinking that it's TSH. This can actually cause symptoms of hyperthyroidism. You can see this in patients with HCG secreting neoplasms like gonadal tumors or hydatiform moles. Alright, we're done with the anterior pituitary. Now let's see if you've learned anything with another exciting flash quiz. So we've talked a lot about hormones today. Let's see if you can name the hormones secreted by the acidophilic cells. Pause the video if you need some time to think. The answer is prolactin and growth hormone, otherwise known as somatotropin. As a refresher, the anterior pituitary hormones are known as flat pig. FSH, LH, ACTH, and TSH are secreted by basophils, whereas prolactin and growth hormone are secreted by acidophils. Now let's go back to our friend the posterior pituitary. Just checking to see if you were listening the first time, where are these hormones produced? In the hypothalamus. Good. There are 2 hormones produced here, so it's not quite as crazy as the anterior pituitary. Vasopressin is produced in the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and oxytocin is produced in the paraventricular nuclei. My mnemonic, and I have no idea why no one's thought of this before, by the way, is VSOP. For those of you who don't know, it's a grade of cognac that means my drink is better than yours. So think about that posterior pituitary next time you pass the Courvoisier. That's about it, but we're going to end with a brief nod to the endocrine pancreas, which will be covered in almost painful detail in the physiology section. The pancreas is made up of a network of ducts and an exocrine system, which, along with the blood supply, will be covered in the GI section. But scattered amongst these are clusters of endocrine cells called the islets of Langerhans. The islets are surrounded by alpha cells, and mostly filled with beta cells. Do you know what these produce? The alpha cells produce glucagon, and the beta cells produce insulin. There's also a smattering of somatostatin-producing delta cells, but they're about as important as the intermediate lobe of the pituitary. And, literally, that's all I'm going to say about them right now. There's a lot more to be said for each of these hormones, but I'm not going to ruin the surprise for you, because next up is endocrine physiology, which is going to be even more awesome, and I encourage you to stick around for it. Until then, thanks for watching, and if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up down below. Arjun Iyer, signing out.